Welcome to Peter's podcast, where we talk about real yoga, actual happiness, and deep living. Thanks for joining me. Hello, Dr. Mona Sobhani. I have invited you here onto my podcast for two reasons. The primary one is that I adore your book, Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a neuroscientist's discovery of the ineffable mysteries of the universe.
Thank you.
Which is a mouthful and so relevant to people who teach yoga and meditation, most of whom are listening to this podcast right now. So I want everyone to read this book. So that's number one, why I wanted you on the podcast, so people are aware of it. And then secondly, I would love, as we go through, for you to help us understand sort of what your take is on the relationship between science and spirituality and how the two can live together in less conflict.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So if you wouldn't mind, for people who don't know you or haven't read the book yet, could you tell me a little bit about your own background,
Yeah.
like your own science
Yeah,
credentials, et cetera?
sure. So um, I'm a neuroscientist and I was always interested in the brain, the human brain and human behavior. So my undergraduate degree was in neuroscience. And then I went on to get a PhD in cognitive neuroscience at USC, which is basically when you see pictures of the human brain like lit up, like MRI scans, that's what I did. So I did my degree in that. I was focused on psychopathic traits, actually, or like just generally personality traits and the relationship to the brain. Um, and then I did a postdoc in law and neuroscience because since I was interested in psychopathic traits, I was interested in like as we find out things about the brain and behavior, does that or will it influence our legal system and how we make punishment decisions? So I did that, and I was never. My mother was spiritual, but I didn't grow up in a spiritual or religious household. And I remember when I was in middle school, I kind of assessed religion and decided that I didn't believe in it and dropped it. And then, I mean, not that I even had a religion to drop, but I just kind of dropped belief. And then but I was really connected to the universe. Like I was always really aware of coincidences. I had so many all the time, and I in college, like when things would fall into my lap, I would just know that I would need them for later, and it was just a way that I lived. I didn't consider it spiritual. I didn't even think about it, but by the time that I finished graduate school, though, they beat that out of you because they teach you that, the universe, the mainstream scientific worldview is that the universe is random, it's dead and meaningless. And then, especially in neuroscience, they teach us that any meaning that you create and any coincidences is from your brain. Like your brain's job is actually to detect coincidences and find patterns and create meaning because that's how we survive in the world. So they teach you that really early on and say like the external world has no inherent meaning. Any meaning that we create is from us in our brains. We create it and we overlay it onto the external world. So by the end of graduate school, that's pretty much when like I said, I wasn't spiritual to begin with, but I was very connected to coincidences and like kind of the magic, the everyday magic of life. But by the end of grad school, that was kind of beaten out of me. And then maybe it's no coincidence that by the time I finished graduate school, um, even though it was supposed to be the happiest time because I had finally gotten this degree I'd been working for years towards, after that, I felt it was probably part of that too. Like the end of working towards a long-term goal was suddenly over, and then the magic was gone, and so I just fell into kind of a not great era, I would say, of my life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when you are talking in your book, you talk a lot about the neuroscientist worldview, and some of which you just summarized a moment ago. And one of the things that stood out to me was you said that neuroscientists are trained to be skeptical because they understand how the brain works so well at doing the kinds of things. It's almost like tricks that the mind will
Right.
play because it needs an explanation of things. Could you elaborate on that a little
Yes.
bit?
Yes. So the well, I don't want to go into all the details, but I will just say that yeah, our brain looks for, as I mentioned briefly, coincidences. So it has a lot of information coming in. And first of all, we have to filter that information because it's too much. So our brain already needs to filter what it thinks is relevant for you. And what's interesting about our biology is that that's different for everyone. So it's based on our past experiences and our current goals. So your brain has all these fine-tuned filters to be like, oh, I'm really interested in, money opportunities right now. So I'll be like fine-tuned to look for those. And then especially as everyone now knows, or it's been talked about in pop culture a lot more, like our early childhood experiences weigh heavily on how our brain filters develop because your brain is more plastic, so to speak, when you're younger. So each of us has these really individual filters, that so all this, there's, if there's like 100 things coming in, your brain is going to filter it down to, let's say, 25 things that it considers relevant to take in and discards the rest, but those 25 things will be different for everyone. And then when it takes in that information, it starts to create correlations and meaning, again based on what you know and what you've been exposed to. And some of those are really and it uses shortcuts to save energy. So a lot of the biases that we have, people are familiar with from psychology, like confirmation bias. So, which is the most famous one I think that people use to discount spiritual things, is saying like you believe in spiritual phenomena, so you look for it, and anytime something happens that you regard as spiritual, you categorize it as spiritual. Anytime it's not, you kind of discard it, and so you keep confirming your own bias of, oh, all these magical spiritual things keep happening, but really it's your brain's filter, and I think that's the one that's most commonly used, um, to discount like anything magical. And to be fair, your brain does do
Right.
that. It does have these shortcuts, they're heuristics, these biases to just save energy. It's like we can't, it would take too much energy to sit and sort through everything. So it just makes shortcuts, and it'll just be like, oh, everyone who drives a Prius is a bad driver. Like I decided, I've had two incidences with Prius drivers. Now they're all bad, and it takes kind of a lot to update your biases. Unfortunately, like it takes more energy to update them, to rewire you.
Right.
But yeah, so there are a lot of and it creates, also there's this interesting thing. So our left, I won't go into all of it, but there's this interesting distinction between our left and our right brains, where our left brains are usually in most people's the side that has speech, and language more generally is in both, but speech is in the left. And so when you have patients, we used to have patients back in the day that would have the wires that connect the two hemispheres, they would have them snipped for reasons like they have epilepsy, intractable epilepsy. So when you
It's
have
like
a
a corpus callosum.
yes, the corpus callosum. So when you
Hmm.
when you disconnect the hemispheres, we call them split brain patients. And this is when you can see the brain, even if the left brain specifically, even if it doesn't have the answer and it doesn't have all the information, it just creates a story. And so you could see that in these patients where, I won't get into the details of the experiment, but basically you would ask them a question like, um, let's say, let's say you present information to their right brain, such as a cup of water, and it can't communicate to the left in these patients. So the left brain that has language doesn't know why it's drinking water. So, but then if you ask the person, like, oh, why did you ask for a cup of water? Or why did you draw a cup of water? The correct answer would be, oh, the researcher gave it to me, or the researcher requested it of me. But the left brain doesn't have that information, so it just makes up a story and says, oh, I must have been thirsty. It deduces something, and it kind of takes,
Right.
oh, usually when I ask for a cup of water it's because I'm thirsty, so that must be the case here, that must be the answer. And but when it comes out, all those words don't come out, it just says, oh, I must have been thirsty. And so the
Right.
brain does
Right.
like make shortcuts, lie in some instances, not like nefariously. It's just its job to have a story, to have an explanation.
To have an
Hmm.
answer. Mhm. That's so interesting. So, so you alluded to the fact that after all your studies, you had a bit of a crisis of purpose and
Right.
whatnot. And this, from what I read, st- you started to have reasons to look into what before was a taboo piece of information, this whole notion of the universe having some kind of way of communicating.
Yes, yes. So my I'm Persian, so in our heritage we have a lot of spiritual uh, traditions that I honestly didn't pay attention to and didn't really consider, like, I don't know, spiritual. But one of them was divination. So my grandmother and my mother would use coffee grounds to divine things about your past, present, and future. And they were my grandmother was very good, and then my mom still still is really great. So she would read my coffee for me, and I um, at first, I'd ignored it, but I would take notes, like a little. This was in graduate school, and I was just starting in graduate school. I would take notes and noticed over time that she was more right than she was wrong. But so I came to trust them and believe in it, but I couldn't explain it with science. And I really couldn't explain it with science because it was symbolic. And it was something my mom had to learn from her mom. Like there were these symbols, like if a turtle shows up, it would mean that the thing that it's related to will happen slowly because turtles are slow. Um, and so things like that. So she had to, and she would explain it to me. And I remember being um, like there was no framework in science that I could use to understand something like that because our framework is so reductionistic and materialistic,
Right.
and definitely not symbolic and kind of like as a whole, right? A symbol as a whole, and I really couldn't understand it. It like would fry my brain if I tried to think about it. So I just lived in cognitive dissonance and didn't pay attention to it. But then after I graduated, actually a few years later, I had and I think up to that point, everything was just kind of fun. My mom would be like, "Oh, I don't know." It was all positive. But then one day, um, she told me she was like, she got uncomfortable and told me, "I think you should expect to receive some bad news." And she's like, "I don't want to tell you this, but it keeps coming up, and I feel like now I have to warn you." And so she wouldn't tell me what it was, but for 6 weeks it kept coming up, and the more it comes up, the more likely it is to happen. So then six
Mm.
weeks later, one of my professors at USC was killed by one of the students, and it was someone I had worked with on a part of my dissertation experiment. So the whole thing was obviously upsetting, but the fact that the coffee predicted a death, which later my mom said, she's like, "Oh, I saw the symbol for a death." But it was such a
Mm.
unique symbol that I'd never. She's like, "I've never seen anything like it before, so I didn't want to tell you because," she's like, "I actually didn't know how to interpret it." And so yeah, so that freaked me out a lot. It really, really upset me because it was a death, right? It was like the information of this person's death like flowed back 6 plus weeks.
Into your coffee.
Yeah, and I just
Yeah.
couldn't understand, and it was really upsetting to me that was the case. And then I wondered about fate and destiny, but at that time I was too busy. I had just started a new job, and I was just too busy to think about it. And I mean, I probably just wasn't really ready to tackle it anyway. So I just ignored it and
Yeah.
lived with that discomfort until a few years later. Then a relationship ended, and then my mom had seen like, oh, it would be positive. But then I didn't think a breakup was positive. So I was like, you were wrong. um, and then I wondered about, what is this? Like, how does it work? Is it always right? Is it always wrong? What are the variables? As a scientist, I was like, what are the variables that determine how right or how wrong it is, or what shows up in the coffee? Um, I'm still like a student. My mom still reads my coffee, and I still am always curious about what shows up and what doesn't, because not everything shows up. So
Yeah.
it's pretty fascinating.
Have you gotten good at reading yourself?
I can see certain things. I'm not like my mom. It's really funny because I'll point out things, or she'll be like, "Oh, this," and then I'll tell her I can't see it, and she'll say it's advanced. Like, okay, thanks.
That's cool. I'm the
Yeah.
doctor, mom.
Yeah.
That's great.
She's like, "This is too advanced for you. You won't be able to see it." I'm like, "Oh,
Uh,
okay."
yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. So again, I really want people to read the book because it's so chock full of so many interesting things. But I'm coming from a yoga background where like spirituality is like de facto, and so
Mm,
to me, I'm always trusting all of these kinds of spiritual things, like being able to have intuitions about things, being able to have experiences, trusting things that come to you.
mhm.
Kind of ability to tap into a wisdom that maybe you didn't get from studying, it just appears and things like that.
Mhm.
So one of the things that really intrigued me about your book was the way that you eventually got into a really, it seems to me, incredibly rigorous survey of so many different kinds of research around all of these qualities. um, could you sort of, I don't want to, it would take us a whole book's length to talk it
Yeah.
through, but maybe to just summarize a little bit of how you've got into it, how you approached it,
Yeah.
and what it brought you to.
Yeah. So okay. So I was like, this symbolic divination reading works. So I started from there. Actually, I didn't fully accept that it worked. It took me a long time, I think, but and I think that's just how it is for people who are in Western culture. It takes a lot, but so I started there, and then I had my dark night was when that relationship ended. It was like I was already having an existential crisis. I had already had a lot of things that were piling up, and that was like the final. I think of it as like the last leg of a stool that was knocked out, and then I was, for the first time, like felt despair and lost hope and optimism, and was the question kept coming into my mind of like, what is the point of this life? Like, why do we do this? And so then from that place, I live in Los Angeles, and my friends had gone to psychics and intuitives, and I never partook because I didn't believe in it or needed it. But they started taking me to psychics, and just out of curiosity, because I was like, well, I know my mom can do this thing, but like, is this a real skill that people have? And from those experiences, yeah, I was like, no, this is like a real thing, and it's really strange. But I didn't believe that anyone had studied it, because that's kind of what you hear, like in mainstream culture, that no one's ever studied it. So I didn't even bother to look for research, which is the funny thing. Instead, I decided to start a personal project of like, oh, I'll just interview the intuitives myself, and because I want to know what they're feeling and seeing. Like, when they say "I see," are they seeing with their eyes, or is it in their mind? So I started interviewing them, and then I was curious if my scientist colleagues were spiritual or religious. We had, like, none of us had ever talked to each other about this stuff. So I interviewed them. And it turned out that a lot of them were very open minded, and they were just like, yeah, like there's so many things science can't explain. Like, this is why we all come into science.
Right.
Um, and then it was through those interviews that I think this I remember. It was I heard an interview by Chelsea Handler, who's an American comedian, of Laura Lynn Jackson, who's a psychic medium. And Laura Lynn Jackson mentioned the Windbridge Institute, the research center. So I looked that up, and it was a center founded by a like toxicology PhD, but who studies mediumship and psychic phenomena. So I immediately contacted them and spoke to the co-founders, and then they gave me a huge reading list. They were like, oh, there's been so much research done on this. It's basically like a very well known phenomena. The science is solid. Here's
Huh.
papers and books, and go do your reading. And so they gave me a huge list, and then that's
Did
when
that
it
shock
started.
you? Obviously.
Completely. Well, first of all, I don't think I believed him. I was like, "Oh, I'll be the judge of that," I'm like arrogant. So I was like, "Okay, let me see where these papers have been published, or like let me read the designs, and I'll be the judge if they were good or not."
Right.
But he was right. They were there was so much research, and they were good scientific designs. They were Many of them were actually similar to what we use in neuroscience and psychology even today. So and like unconscious responses, which I'm really interested in because that's not something you can fake. And by that I mean, like we measure heart rate and we measure sweating off people, and we consider
Hmm.
those like automatic responses from people. So you can elicit those in advance of someone seeing something, and that's still a psychic phenomena, and that's incredible. So yeah, I read the papers and I was just blown away because there really had been so much. And I couldn't stop reading because there was literally over 100 years worth. So it took me a while. So it started there. And then I branched off, then I started listening to podcasts, and then, they'd refer to other people. Then the reincarnation research at the University of Virginia. So I read that. And I was really interested in past life regression because, um, on that podcast interview between Chelsea Handler and Laura Lynn Jackson, they had mentioned Many Lives, Many Masters by Brian Weiss. And so that book was really the one also that tipped me, like, because he was Yale and Columbia educated, he was a psychiatrist, he was an atheist, he was a skeptic. And by the end of like his session with this one patient, he was suddenly curing this patient through reliving a past life. And that really, really interested me from a healing perspective, like a neuroscience, psychology, biology perspective. I was like, this isn't
Yeah.
like how can we explain this? So I went down that rabbit hole too. I read a lot of the past life regression, and that, I mean, that even convinced me more because um, these were people who are doing a practice, right? Like it's one thing for scientists in a lab to be like, I'm just going to explore this and this doesn't affect anyone. My findings will be published in a paper and nothing will come of it. But these were, like Brian Weiss and Roger Wolger and Michael Newton were all PhDs who didn't necessarily believe. It sounds like a lot of them stumbled onto it, but found it so useful that they ended up using it in their practice to confidently heal thousands of patients. And that to me
Amazing.
just spoke a lot to the power of it and the value of it. And I thought, it doesn't even matter if the spiritual part's not true. It's true enough that it elicits a healing in the person. And that's a phenomenon that we should pay attention to.
Right. But in addition to like the potential like archetypal whatever, there's actual research that is hard to refute in terms of people's
Yes.
experiences as well that you bring up in your book.
Oh, yeah, yeah, and there's all kinds of like, even for the past life stuff, the things that would convince me were, like, 2 people would recount the same past life, and they wouldn't know each other, or and you would see a lot of that kind of thing, which is just too difficult to explain in any other way. And especially with the reincarnation research too from the University of Virginia, which is done with children, I think between the ages of 2 and 5. I think for 65 or 70% of those cases, they can actually go back and like find the identity of the person the child is describing. It's that accurate.
Right.
And they've done this for years and years, so they have a bulletproof a protocol for doing this. So
Right.
yeah, so it is after digging into all that, you really can't think of another explanation for it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's just amazing. Um, I say it's amazing, but like I say, coming from where I come from, I just always accepted all of this stuff. But it's such a treat because in my field, I end up with people who come out of like daily normal lives and they come into yoga and we start talking about some of this stuff and they're like, "What?" And so the surveying that you've done and everything is just so delightful, and I've been quoting you for months in classes and whatnot. So it's been very
It's
helpful.
nice to have, I think. I think that for people like me, it's a personal choice to believe, right? To believe in anything. And in my case, though, the training and, well, as I say in the book, in the end, it ended up being my identity that was at really what was that threat was being threatened. So
Right.
yeah, it's just like some people have more or less of that and are more willing to accept things
Y-
that work for them. But for
Yeah,
me,
and
I
I
needed
should. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I should clarify, like you say, you're very, very clear in the book that there was like an old you and this new you that was unfolding, and that the
Hmm.
old you is as skeptical as anybody I've ever met, right?
Yeah. Yeah, she's still here. She still she still comes around. She's always here. But yeah,
Yeah.
there was yeah, and she it's like weird talking about in third person, but yeah, that identity was very did not want to let go and was like, I have worked hard to get here to where we are, and I refuse to just let you throw this away. But like I think I say it in the book. If not, I'll just say it now. But yeah, but I was happier than I had ever been, than I had been in a long time. So it was like my soul was happier than it had been in so long, but my ego was threatened and not happy. And it was really interesting to watch even that distinction happen. And I was like, what is going on? I thought my ego was me, you know? And so
Uh-huh.
yeah, so to watch that all unfold was, just part of the lesson.
Yeah, that's awesome. Can I pick your brain a little on like this distinction you've said a couple of times, psychology and neuroscience? Could you distinguish those two because um,
Sure.
they're very different, right?
Yes, yes. Yes. So in neuroscience, which is so the way that neuroscience is taught, I should say, in our schools right now, is it focuses very much on molecular, the cells, the individual neurons, how they connect to each other, the systems that they make up, which are like our central nervous system, our autonomic nervous system. And then the reason I chose cognitive neuroscience was because it was a little bit less that I had already done a lot of the cell and molecular in undergraduate, and I wanted something higher level like human behavior. That's why I chose cognitive neuroscience. But then when I went into cognitive neuroscience, it was a lot of like motor sensory. So it's like I mentioned before, things come in through your senses, your brain processes it, and then might make an output, which is a behavior, or a movement, which is what we call motor. And so sensory, it's a lot of sensory motor. And even when I chose, I chose personality traits, the correlation between personality traits and brain function and structure. But I had to go learn about psychopaths, because that's what my topic was. I had to go learn about all of that on my own. No, there were no classes on any of that. So I became aware as I was learning neuroscience that the only psychology that they would teach us was, as I mentioned before, like the biases, these kind of perceptual biases that we have, because you need to know those when you're doing your experiments to control for that. But I didn't know a single thing about clinical psychology at all, like except for the psychopath, like the psychopathy checklist, the things that relate to personality, that I knew, but I didn't know anything. And then I remember, as I was going through this journey, this happened because of the past life regression stuff that I was reading about. I was like, come to think of it, I don't know, how else would someone treat anxiety. I'm like, what do people use? What kinds of therapies are used? What kinds of methods are taught in psychology courses today? And the answer, it turns out, is that the majority of programs focus on cognitive behavioral therapy, which is only, well, I won't get into it, but it's not the it's the most evidence based, but it's some would argue it's the most effective, but it's not for every scenario. But anyway, I didn't know any of that. And so I remember when I was reading about the past life regression stuff, I just realized I don't know anything about clinical psychology. I don't know anything about different, states of consciousness, like all these things that because I was reading about psychedelics too, and I just thought there's so much I don't know. I'm like, how can I even have a model of the human brain when I am missing so much of the human experience? And then it just became this point of annoyance for me and like irritation that our training programs in neuroscience don't focus on that. And I thought, especially as I myself would meditate and get into altered states and try psychedelics, I came back thinking, oh my God, we don't know anything. We don't know. We know, like human consciousness is this much. Like we know a tiny sliver because we're only focused on normal waking consciousness when we talk about neuroscience. There's only a few labs focused on sleep or dream or anesthetics, and those are not even the interesting states of consciousness.
Wow.
So
And you mentioned in your book that this terminology, like the easy problem and the difficult problem, I think you called it, about
yes.
like what neuroscience is focusing on sort of like seeing what the mechanisms of things are, but not necessarily knowing what it means.
Yes, yes. So this it's called the easy and hard problem of consciousness, and it's the hardest problem, quote unquote, in or mysteries in all of science, but especially in neuroscience. And what it means is we're very good at measuring the brain, right? We're good at measuring function and blood flow and stuff, and we can describe it. We could say your amygdala is active, it's connected to your prefrontal cortex, but all we're doing is describing and correlating that with your conscious experience. But we can't measure what it feels like to be you. Like me sitting here talking to you, or me looking at the color red, or a sunset, or eating an ice cream, or all the ways that when I close my eyes and I know what it feels like to be me, we can't connect that, which is we call phenomenal, we can't connect that to the firing of our neurons yet. Like we can correlate the experiences, but we actually can't even measure this phenomenal consciousness well enough to tie it back to neurons and differentiate it between people. So, like, I'll never know what it's like to be you. You'll never know what it's like to be me because
Uh-huh.
it's individual to each of us, and we can't measure it. We try with these surveys that we create, which like dumbs down your entire human experience to like 15 questions, but we,
Right.
we can't. And so there, it's called the easy problem is saying, when you're afraid, when you tell me you're afraid, your amygdala lights up. That's the easy problem. But the hard problem is what is the actual link between your feeling state, um, and like the neural correlate, like what in the neuron makes you feel afraid, we is the hard problem.
Right.
So yeah, it's
I
the
get a
biggest
little
problem.
I get a little frustrated when I hear neuroscientists talk about things we could do or describing something that's happening, because it almost seems like the that information about, oh, the amygdala is getting a more blood flow, that's what's happening, but really the only thing that matters is that you're afraid or you have anxiety or
Mhm.
whatever, and that's just like this extra dump
Yeah.
of language on top. But maybe I'm missing something, because
No,
it
I
sounds very exciting or very, important, but I don't know what I
yes.
gained from it.
No, I completely agree. And I've always felt that way. That's actually part of the reason why I left neuroimaging work, is because I just felt like we weren't actually, in my opinion, doing much, like besides describing what the brain is doing, which is a worthwhile thing for people to do, but it's not everything. And I get really frustrated too when I hear, I mean, I cannot listen to neuroscience podcasts. They drive me nuts, because you hear a lot of this, a lot of, oh, you're just afraid because your amygdala is firing. But that's not true. Why is your amygdala firing? There's a reason. There's a reason,
Right,
tied, right. And that's where tying psychology back in works, because then that's where you tie in early childhood experiences. So why did your brain wire the way it is that this trigger causes your amygdala to fire? Yes, and again, it's you're not afraid because your amygdala is firing. That's a correlation, but there's a reason behind that, right? There's a why. And and when I talk now or write, I try to emphasize this a lot because you see it missing in a lot of neuroscience. The only thing neuroscience and most of science does is describe physiological processes. That's all we do is describe. We can't tell you why. We can guess. We can use evolutionary biology to make educated guesses, but nobody can tell you why for certain, right? So it's like
right,
it is time for us to own up that we're just describing and making our best guesses, but yeah, but it should never be the final word on something.
right. And I mean, of course, that said, there's been a lot of information that does affect like what behaviors might help this or that.
Mhm.
So I don't want to discount it, but
No, of
and
course,
I
yeah.
also
I
find it
think it's
frustrating.
useful.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, I was impressed, like as I go through there's this term in yoga called siddhi, and I know you've done some reading in yoga as well, but like siddhi is like powers or the abilities that
Mhm.
you have as you do a practice for a long time. And um, I've heard Paramahansa Yogananda's book that's called Autobiography of a Yogi. I've heard it
Mhm.
called a fantasy book, and yet many of the things that you study are totally in there. And
Mhm.
you describe a lot of the research that is about either receiving mental information or projecting
Mhm.
mental information, which breaks with the neuroscience materialist model,
Yeah.
and yet there's tons of data on it.
Yes. Yeah, there is. That was I think that's what's kind of interesting for me in this journey was since I was a neuroscientist, it was really, really difficult for me to understand these phenomena. But and you're right, because that's what it is. I mean, and the funny thing is, I didn't write about this in the book, but I used to have precognitive dreams when I was young, and I just stopped having them after graduate school. Of course, now they've come back full force, but and a lot of other things have too. But the it is so at first I couldn't get around that, but then I started reading a lot of different models of consciousness in the brain. And I don't know if maybe the first one I encountered was Aldous Huxley's Mind at Large in his book. Oh, shoot, I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, one of his books. Um, the Doors of Perception, I think. Yeah, so he talks about that and kind of like the mind being a filter, that actually consciousness is external and it filters through our mind. And I remember being like, that's not possible. But as I read more and more, I found a whole group of scientists and physicists who are basic, they call themselves post materialist, which means they're moving past the materialist paradigm. And once you do that, you open up the possibility for other models. And a lot of them have published models saying consciousness could be this energy field that interacts with our biological brains in this way that filters information. So I've read a lot of actual theories in actual scientific journals proposing this. And I think we're starting to see a little bit more of that now because the traditional or the mainstream models of consciousness, as I mentioned, they don't really, well, first of all, they do not account for any type of anomalous perception or cognition or behavior because they don't even accept that. So that's outside the
Right.
model. So it works fine for their normal consciousness. But if you want to include every part of the human experience, then they fall very short. And I think that's why you're starting to see these broader models saying maybe consciousness is broader. Maybe it filters in. Maybe sometimes we can widen the filter and tap into something and get more information than normal. And that's where I stand now. Like I've
Yeah.
experienced it enough to know. And actually, I in the beginning I would listen to Ram Dass religiously, and I still do. I love him, and he would talk about right these experiences with his guru. And I remember that was happening in the beginning. And I remember thinking, like, ah, oh, this is so wild, but I trust Ram Dass. Like, I remember just thinking, like, I don't know, I believe it. But this was really early on, like even before I had looked at the studies. I remember just
Yeah.
thinking, this is incredible. And then I found the studies, and then it all fell into place.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned like Carlo Rovelli in your book, and a few other physicists who are, thinking in these bigger ways. I
Mhm.
personally, I've just come around to the concept that I think the universe is way too complicated for us to grasp, and yet we are part of we're like a moment in the evolution of it, right? So we
Mhm.
are part of it, and the universe, and we are not only able to speak to each other, but we are literally each other. And any model you want to choose, there'll be some way you can communicate about something in that. And so I try now to just look at all the different ways you can think about things as being just a model through which we can interact in a certain way and gain a
Yeah.
certain something.
Yeah.
So, um, so it's,
Me too. I try to stay
yeah,
open. We don't know. I mean, who knows?
right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I actually jotted something down because you said, um, oh yeah, let's see. something around like our mental capacity to perceive and describe things, uh, it like exceeds or transcends the capacity. I don't know if I'm paraphrasing
Yeah.
here, but that we may never be able to know all of that stuff.
Yes. We it's it's actually like when you learn neuroscience when you learn neuroscience, actually when you learn any biology, you're kind of amazed that anything works at all in our bodies, because the amount of miracles that have to happen for everything to work and function together is incredible. And neuroscience is the same. Our brains, like the the timing, the way things are connected, for everything to come together and for you to make sense to you is a miracle, honestly. So, and then the fact that you can interact with other people and be on the same, like same consciousness, same level,
Right.
it's pretty incredible. And I mean, that is part of why it's so hard for us to explain it. That's where you understand that our tools and our understanding and our models are all limited. Um, we have not come close to explaining this miracle, really, of life.
Yeah. Yeah. Which keeps us interested, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely worth trying to keep trying to do.
Yeah. So what are you doing? I mean, you wrote your book a while ago now, and obviously took a long time to do all the research that went into it. Where are you finding
Yeah.
yourself now?
I actually, um, so I've been Okay. So let's see. Last year in November, a collaborator and I were like, what if we went to the biggest neuroscience conference and held a neuroscience and spirituality social, and we just like saw who shows up? And I didn't think anyone would show up. But we had 50 neuroscientists show up, like graduate students, postdocs, faculty, and we were blown away. And they wanted to stay in touch. They wanted a mailing list. They wanted references to read. And so we set up a list. We send out like a newsletter once a month just to highlight books and podcasts and articles for them. But we're going to organize another one this year in in November at the neuroscience conference in Washington, D.C. And we're going to actually put together a panel on alternative models of consciousness, because there are neuroscientists who have alternative models. So we wanted to put together a panel on that. And then her and I also, we did organize and we want to do more these science and spirituality retreats. So, we've met so many people interested, so many scientists interested in these topics, but they don't have community. They don't have other people interested. They don't even know where to go to read things, and they also need to feel safe. Oh, and you actually asked at the beginning, and I did want to talk about this. Like the bridge between science and spirituality is interesting because like you have to, just like old me, kind of have to be delicate with their egos and their, so you don't threaten them. And so I always joke like I want to do these retreats, but we cannot sage them when they walk in. Like we can't be
Yeah.
like we can't we can't be like waving Palo Santo at them. Like it has to be done
Yeah.
in a way that doesn't threaten them, but where they can come and like learn about the science that they don't have time to read on their own, or they can come, engage in like a class, an energy class, or have a reading, or I don't know. We have a bunch of ideas, so we're working on putting those together, to kind of help people have a space to, and then we're going to do some for non-scientists too, because we actually had way more interest from people who weren't scientists than from scientists. So
Right.
we're planning a few of those for the future.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. It's such a ripe, I think, chapter break. People are searching, and um, I find it in my own work that people come to yoga from all these different walks of life, and it just enriches whatever it is that they're doing. So,
Yeah. And I
yeah.
think also, to answer your question at the very beginning, like I think that in my mind, and I've always felt this way, honestly, when people say supernatural or paranormal, I don't know, in my mind, it's like it's one universe, it's one reality. It it really shouldn't, or it probably isn't, science and spirituality. Like it's probably all just one thing, and we just haven't chosen we haven't found the right lens to look through
Right.
to see it all as one. And I think that's just the challenge for us going forward. But I think the first part to addressing that challenge is what my partner and I want to do is kind of show, hey, like we used to be where you are, and there's ways to dip your toe in without being scared and overwhelmed, but to just see that there's a little more to this reality than just our five senses. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And like you say, there are so many people who are interested in that in the science world as well. I remember a long time ago, I had a teacher trainee who was married to a geneticist. And she said, I teach these guys and they're scientists and I can't talk about any of this stuff. Her husband was like the most regular student in my classes of anyone. So,
It's very common. It's
yeah.
it's much more common than people know. I actually found another larger group. We made a group. We have like 80 people now, but I found a larger group that has 600 scientists and scholars, like
Hmm.
physicians, and two-thirds of them are anonymous because
Hmm.
of the stigma. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been delightful to get to talk with you and flesh out some of what I read in your book. And
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to meet you.
absolutely, yeah. All right. Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.